Roastar packaging is continually innovating. They aren't where they were more than a decade ago when they won Best New Product at San Diego's Coffee Fest. They've actually gotten better, driven by their 5-step plan. Step 1, make better packaging. Step 2, make it domestically. Step 3, make it easy for small business owners. Step 4, make it look awesome. Step 5, world domination. It's working, as they just won Best New Product at Coffee Fest New York for their new peel and stick valved tin closure. That's hard to say, but it's a win for Roastar and a win for small business. On roastery.com, you can use their artwork templates to enable you to imagine your artwork, your logo, on a sleek coffee bag, classic tin, sticker, or label. Roastar has been and is tipping the scales to favor solo entrepreneurs and small businesses, using digital printing to offer faster turnaround times and smaller print runs for coffee roasters. In short, Roastar can help and grow your business. And on roastery.com, you can start with a quote and end with the perfect coffee package to share your story. Now, on to the show. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Season 10 of the Coffee People Podcast, which is part of the Roast West Coast Coffee Network and presented by Roastar Coffee Packaging. I'm Ryan Woldt, and this is the Coffee Podcast where we meet really interesting people from all corners of the coffee industry. Actually, I don't think interesting is an interesting enough word. Trying again. This is the Coffee Podcast where we meet compelling people from the world of coffee. Today's guest is definitely that. Joining the podcast from Berlin, Germany is James Harper, the founder, host, producer, and piano player behind Filter Stories, a podcast which listens like an audio documentary. It's one of my favorite podcasts, and in it, James exemplifies what it means to take a narrative deep dive into the more complex corners of coffee, but in a way that is both entertaining to listen to and easy for even me to understand. While you're listening to this show today, be sure to follow Filter Stories on your favorite podcast platform or head to filterstories.org. You'll find links in this podcast's show notes or, of course, on the newsletter that we send out every time a podcast is released. It's available online at coffeepeoplepodcast.com. Wherever you are, I hope you have a lovely cup of your favorite coffee filling your mug, and I imagine you're settling into a crushed velvet chair the color of a charred mandarin, and steam is entangling itself in the long strands of thought emanating from your brain. And what was I talking about? Oh yeah, it's time for the show, the very first in Season 10 of Coffee People, featuring James Harper, the voice and human behind Filter Stories.
That's really intense.
That's what you do when you are trying to avoid other stress in your life.
That's for a different podcast. That's for the Esther Perel podcast.
There's no rules on this show. We have a lot of tangents. Right. Speaking of which, if you wouldn't mind, for the people who will eventually listen to this, tell them what your name is and who you are and what your show is and what you do.
Sure. It's really weird. I'm usually the one asking the question. I never have to present who I am. Anyway, I'm James Harper. I'm Italian-Australian. Live in Berlin. Not that any of that matters, but what I'm most known for is creating a podcast called Filter Stories, which is a NPR-style, kind of BBC-style narrative podcast that goes deep into the history, sustainability, science of coffee.
And I am going to get to all that. I have a bunch of questions about it, and I'm hoping to steal a bunch of your techniques later. But I think it does matter that you're in Berlin because I'm here in California. You had asked me that. I didn't answer earlier. Southern California. And we're connected over this one thing that we both appreciate and do. Yes, we both have podcasts, but more importantly, we both have podcasts because of coffee. And that's one of the things that I love about this industry as a whole is every morning when I drink a cup of coffee, I am connected to some other place in the world, and I can think about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I actually have, right now, I'm drinking some coffee from my favorite roaster here in Berlin, 19 grams, and they have this coffee advent calendar. There's a lot of coffee in each tin, so I couldn't finish it in December. I'm still into it, drinking it during February. But yeah, it's like I'm like traveling the world with coffee. I think today I was in, where was I? Costa Rica? It's extraordinary.
It's really amazing, and you learn things about other places that you wouldn't have learned. I don't want to get too far into your podcast yet because I have a lot of questions about it. I want to learn more about you, James Harper. I'm wondering, what were you doing before Filter Stories? This isn't the only thing you've ever done. And so what was your life like before this podcast?
Oof. Okay. Well, I began my career in finance in the UK, in London. I worked for the Bank of England, actually. My dad was in finance. My granddad was in finance. I don't know. Kind of that was the strong push I was getting. And there was a lot I enjoyed about it, but also fundamentally, it was an industry which it wasn't speaking to my soul. But when you're in your mid-20s, do you really know who you are and what you want? Dare I ask, Ryan, if you know what you want at your age?
I'm in my early 40s and I'm still figuring it out. So no, the answer is no.
Okay. So anyway, yes, I wanted to figure it out, and but I knew finance wasn't it for me. So I left. I went just kind of exploring the world. Like, well, I'm young. Let me see what's around. And spent 18 months kind of going to different parts of the world, 6 months of which were spent in India. The crowning achievement of which was getting a motorcycle and kind of going north to south on that for 3 months, despite having never ridden one before in my life. It was during that time I had to decide, okay, what next in my life? Where do I go? And coffee had always been calling me in different parts of my life. Back in finance, my favorite, I would try to avoid working as much as possible and always be down the local specialty coffee shop, for business meetings, quote unquote.
Sure.
And, but even at university, I had an espresso machine that was gifted to me by a neighbor of mine back in Italy, because I'm half Italian. And when I was going to school in Rome, actually, you'd get this, most schools would have a cafeteria, a tuck shop. My school had an espresso bar. So there I was, slamming down cappuccinos next to my teachers, being like, all right, I'll see you in 10 minutes, Mr. Cass. Homework will be ready, don't you worry. So coffee's always been a part of my life, and I loved it so much. And I thought, well, who knows? Let's have another adventure. So I decided, let's pursue coffee. Went to Australia, Melbourne, because I'm also half Australian, and tried to get a job as a barista. And no one would hire me there.
Sure, your banker's experience didn't lead into barista.
They're like, this guy's not going to hang around, and they were totally right. I ended up working for a roastery in Australia, kind of commercial coffee roaster, actually owned by Coca-Cola. So that was an experience. Like, wow, okay. Ended back into a corporate kind of setting. Wasn't speaking to my soul either. So I'm like, I want to get into craft coffee. So I came to Berlin for a job. And that was being the wholesale manager for a quite well-known coffee roaster called The Barn. And I did that for a year and a half. And again, came a point where I'm like, okay, this has been really fun, but something's not quite working for me here. This is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. And this is 2017 at this point. And I've always loved stories. I've loved adventure. I love stories. I've loved exploring and understanding how the world works. I knew in the world of coffee that there didn't exist an NPR, a narrative podcast that explained it. I had this burning curiosity to understand, why is the industry the way it is? I'd sell these, I talk to my customers, right? And I'd be like, this coffee is from this washing station in Rwanda. And it's like, who are these people, running the washing station? Who are the people delivering coffee? What are their lives? I'd have to, presenting this coffee as if I knew them, but I knew nothing. And I wanted to know, how do things actually work? So I had this burning curiosity, and also a love for narrative audio, NPR, This American Life. Did you know my podcast app tells me I have heard over 2,500 hours worth of podcasts.
Yeah.
Since I downloaded it.
My wife says that she and the dog know I'm home when they hear someone else's voice talking, coming up the steps.
That's brilliant. So no one in coffee had done a narrative podcast, that kind of deep dive, exploration, story crafting. And I thought, hey, let's have this adventure and see what happens. And that was the beginning. I bought a flight to Guatemala, some microphones, had to learn Spanish in 6 weeks, and
Wow.
the rest is just history, really.
I don't want to question your life choices, but were you thinking at the time, this is just something that I need to do? It's something for me. Or did you see a future in which I could maybe make a living doing this?
I was thinking, okay, I make a really, really good podcast, and people will listen to it, and then I'll have so many listeners that I can put in, some advertising in it and make a living out of that. That didn't happen. I very quickly realized that wasn't going to happen for many reasons. The business model was terrible, absolutely terrible. No, so the business model didn't work, and I was hoping to make money out of it, but I didn't really know how. And really, the last, 6 years has been, and even today, it's still a journey trying to find a way, more successfully, more recently, of course, than before, of just trying to make a living out of this. But today I am a full-time podcaster, and I do make a living out of it, and I can pay for a mortgage, and the business kind of ticks along.
You give us all hope, James. When you landed in Guatemala that first time, you've got some rough Spanish, and you've got a couple of microphones.
Yeah.
What made you think people would even talk to you?
Well, some didn't. so
Sure.
There we are. I recall I happened to join a friend of mine who was also in Guatemala on a coffee sourcing kind of trip. The exporter, he was working with or talking to, famously in the industry, very, very, very kind of coy around microphones. And actually, I probably had the one and only time I had a situation where someone was like, "Can you please turn the microphone off?" And my first time doing this, I'm like, "Oh my Lord, am I doing something wrong here? Like, can I not record just people chit chatting about quality in a mill?" But no, it's really kind of frightened. The sort of people who are like, no photographs on the farm, because if someone sees a picture of a laborer carrying their child, and they're gonna think perhaps this is child labor, etc., etc. So they're very careful about their image. I've not had that problem anywhere else again, but it just happened. The one person who it's a problem with, it was my first time, and it was mortifying, absolutely mortifying. Like, oh, I'm doing something wrong here. Oh, am I going to screw it all up? This whole podcast is already doomed from the start.
You just mentioned child labor as a concern, obviously image, and there are a lot of stories in coffee that lead us down tough and difficult conversation paths. And one thing that I really appreciate about your show, Filter Stories, is that you don't shy away from those topics in politics, history. More recently, you've been investing in the curiosity of science, which I just listened to your Perception show, which I loved.
Thank you.
Why do you feel that you have the right perspective to present those stories, and what makes you think that people want to hear those stories? And I ask that because it can be polarizing to talk about something like how your coffee is potentially paying for Trump's border wall, right? Like, those are topics that you might go, oh, I don't know if this is good for the business of podcasting, but makes for a good show. How do you find that line in this is what I want to learn about and what I want to share? It's a big question. I'm known for asking big questions.
Yeah. Many strands to it. I am curious about the world, and I can put myself into the shoes of, I think, of a lot of people, a lot of my friends, and also my listeners, and I can kind of see where they're at in their understanding and what they know about the world, the coffee world specifically. And and you have these questions sometimes in conversation, like, how does that work? In the case of El Salvador, which I think you're referring to with the Trump border wall thing, why is it that El Salvador was, it was all the rage 50 odd years ago, and now it's barely even a rounding error in terms of global coffee production? It's like, what happened? And you have a high level answer, but really, what actually happened? What's the long term story there? And I kind of say, well, let me go and figure it out, and I'll report back to you. So I see myself as more of a vehicle for doing the hard work of investigating and exploring and presenting you, what I took away from my exploration. And I'm going to tell you the story as I see it, as I experienced it, to help you in your understanding of the coffee world.
When you are exploring a topic, like your recent, you have a new season out about science and coffee. You had a multi-part show on the perception of how we perceive taste, which I thought I'm still listening to, and I've listened to a few times. How do you know when a story ends? You go into this, and there's so much content. You're testing, you're tasting, you're sharing with others and getting their feedback. I don't think that you have a background as a scientist, but you're doing experiments. How do you know when this process ends and you're like, I think there's a story here and I need to start working on telling the story?
Oh, my Lord. I actually just wrote a letter. You're on Substack too, I see.
Yes.
That's really cool. I'm also on Substack. I just got onto it. And I wrote a story recently on my newsletter about that very episode and the horrendously torturous process I went through to create it. When does it end? Well, I'll tell you what, I got it wrong, badly wrong. And it cost me many, many weeks of hard work, which I actually had to press delete on.
Oh.
And I had the worst thing happen where one of my test listeners, who actually often in the early phases of my drafts is my dad, before I bring it on to other people in, coffee world, etc. But I remember playing him, this draft episode, and within 5 minutes, he was like slumbering in his chair. Like, this is terrible. So yeah, I realized, well, as a story, this thing is not hitting the mark. And also it's gone off in directions which I can't really do justice to. And I haven't answered the most important question of all this talk about how our sense of smell and taste work. Why does it matter for a coffee drinker? And of course, I knew the answer, but I hadn't articulated the answer in a way which was intriguing to the listener. And so I had to completely reformat that episode from scratch. And then I'm like, right, well, I have a two-parter to answer this question, and that's all. And I'm going to cap it at 40 minutes. I've already wasted too much time trying to get the first drafts out. Now I'm just going to make it straight.
What you just said, though, about how you're producing this thing and there's work that you did that essentially got deleted, and how challenging that can be. That's kind of how I look at making a cup of coffee. I do this show in part because I'm kind of an idiot about coffee, and I can learn how to do things over and over again and still not really get them right. Science is not my forte. And there is a lot of coffee is kind of like a little mini science experiment every morning, right?
Absolutely.
And it's one of the reasons I find the relationship between roasters and coffee drinkers so interesting. It's because unlike any other product, really, they're doing half of a science experiment, and then they're giving it to somebody with no experience generally, and saying, finish the experience, the experiment in a way that makes it right for you. And that answer is a little subjective. You mentioned you were drinking a Costa Rica coffee today. I'm drinking a blended coffee, and today I made it with a ratio of 17 to 1, grams of coffee and water to coffee.
Are you crazy? You went one above 16 to 1?
Well, yesterday I did 15, and I thought, well, I'm going to swing all the way the other way and go see what happens. And
sounds quite scientific to me, though.
But I'm not like taking notes or anything, but I am thinking about that and telling a story. Forget the podcast format. For you're experiencing telling stories almost like an experiment as well. You need to figure out where to put things so that people are invested. And it must be much more challenging for you because you have this voice that sounds like you should be on a meditation app. It's just very smooth, like caramel.
It's just that's just AI processing. The technology these days.
So that leads me to this question of why does it matter that this coffee education is out there? I mean, is it just because people want to learn it, or how do you think it actually helps grow the community of coffee?
Well, I mean, well,
I ask because I question this all the time. Why do people need whatever it is that I'm doing with the show?
Why do people need it?
Why do they want it? Why do people keep coming and going, wow, this is made an impact in a way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the things that I explore are things which I think can either, they can elevate your experience of drinking coffee, right? So my smell and taste episode, a lot of it's focused on how can you learning about how your sense of smell and taste work help you better appreciate coffee and just get more fun, more value from it when you drink it every morning, because you know the backstory and you can taste the nuances, and every nuance has a backstory. You can understand terroir better, different regions, etc. So there's that. I'm just working on a story. I've just literally just posted a story which will drop in a few weeks on organic coffee. And to me, organic coffee, when I first heard about it, I'm like, oh, so what? Organic? I'm not particularly organically minded as a person. But when I went to Honduras and I understood why it matters that soil is kind of teeming with life and different microorganisms in this kind of healthy balance, and how that is often, and how actually most of our coffee is grown in soil that's not that. It's has a lot of fungicides and herbicides, and there's a lack of biology in the soil. I'm like, no, shoot, organic matters here. We're talking about the soils of the earth. This matters. And so, I mean, every episode ties into an aspect of, something that I think is really important in the world, be it environmental, social, sustainability in the broader sense, or even just us appreciating coffee more and enjoying our lives more. Because coffee's that 5 minutes in the day where you're like, wow, if nothing else, I had a good cup of coffee today.
It is amazing how a good cup of coffee can change the trajectory of my morning.
Right.
One thing I think everyone who listens to Filter Stories notices right away is the piano. And
yes.
I was shocked to learn that was actually you playing the piano.
Oh, thank you.
Shocked in a good way. I'm wondering, what is the role the piano plays beyond just being a transition in the show? What does the piano mean to you? How did you get started playing?
Well, I'll tell you what, if I wasn't making coffee podcasts, I'd be a musician. And actually, maybe if, whatever, if I could rewind time and I was a 16-year-old, maybe that's the path I would have taken, maybe. Or maybe not, I don't know. But when I was a teenager, I was a bit of a kind of socially awkward kid, but I was super into music. It's like, that was the language through which I understood myself and the world. I'm the kind of kid who's writing symphonies in his, in his room, or everybody else is, smoking weed down at the, on the streets, and I'm writing symphonies or whatever. They're terrible, by the way, terrible, unlistenable things. I love music and piano. I improvise a lot in piano. It's my kind of creative outlet. Has been for many, many years, my entire life. So when I started Filter Stories, there weren't podcasts out there, narrative podcasts that had piano music. Everybody had this kind of beautiful custom-made music from session musicians, or they used popular music, right, which you have to pay money for. And I'm like, well, I'm doing this on a shoestring here, and actually, I know what kind of music I want right now, and it's actually really hard to get out there to find it. Screw it, I'll just make it myself. Is it going to work? Well, let's see. And so that's how I began improvising, and it's literally a process of, you kind of know when the music needs to come in, because as a listener, you're you feel like something's coming to an end and you want to be brought into the next moment, or maybe there's a long stretch of narration and it's it just needs a little something to just accentuate a certain emotion. And so I press play on my own narration, and I just kind of jam it in the back, and I do a couple of takes of that, listening over and over, jamming, and I'm like, right, got it, that's a take, in it goes. Okay, moving on with the story.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, listening to a movie without music is a really challenging thing. And I think with the types of stories you're telling, it really enhances.
Thank you.
It allows your brain to connect to it in a way that maybe you couldn't if you were just trying to focus on the content, on the stories.
Yeah.
My wife works in special needs, and she was just telling me about a student who is mostly nonverbal, but can sing any popular pop song start to finish perfectly. And that's how they communicate, essentially.
Wow.
And it's a different part of our brain that connects with music that connects with language. And so when you put them together, it's such a cool way to retain things.
Yeah, thank you. Just thinking about Yeah, I think the one time where there was an episode I was making in my History of Coffee series, which is probably my most popular series to date. And the second episode is particularly dark. Like we're talking about the history of slavery. And we don't hold back. I mean, we we open up the manuals that coffee growers had written, in like French colonized modern day Haiti. And it's, we're talking about whips and the rest of it. And it's hard listening. And I was like, and it's hard enough as it is, but also I wanted the music here to kind of create a sense of like just the depth of what we're talking about here. So you have these long passages where it's just quite dissonant music, long spaced out dissonant music, which you just I want you to reflect on this thing, like what does it mean to live to grow coffee, with whips? I mean, think about that for a second, Yeah, anyway, I just, when I think about music and piano, I oftentimes go back to that moment of trying to composing that music, because that's probably the most jarring stuff I've ever made.
What I hear there is you saying that you were able to invoke an emotion with the music that maybe the words couldn't do alone. And,
yes, exactly.
Talking about something as challenging as slavery is difficult enough, but to actually feel it and have it make a difference is a different thing than understanding it. Knowledge base.
Absolutely. Well said.
You've had the opportunity to travel, or I shouldn't say you had it. You've taken the opportunity to travel because of this show. Mm-hmm. It started with your traveling to Guatemala. Beyond just exploring new cultures, how does traveling enhance your life, and how has it enabled you to connect with coffee people? I'd love to know just like a list of maybe like, hey, here's a quick list of places I've been in the last couple of years, because it sounds pretty awesome.
Oh my Lord, where have I been for the podcast? Well, I've been basically across Europe, but that's I've been to America a bunch of times, as in the USA. But in terms of coffee producing countries, I mean, it was Kenya, Ethiopia, and I've done Central America a lot. Colombia as well, and Ecuador. And this year, I'm going to be in Brazil, actually for an unrelated thing, for a BBC documentary I'm producing, but that's something else. And hopefully Peru. And I mean, what the thing is, what I find extraordinary about traveling to coffee producing countries, you can have whatever conception you want, sitting, here I am sitting in Berlin. I can have whatever conception I want about how coffee is grown and who these people are and how it all works. But it's not until you're there and you see it and you're like, oh, I get it. I've had the privilege of, I've always wondered, like, why, you see from the outside, how hard the coffee system is as a farmer. It's like, why would anybody, I would not choose to be a coffee farmer. I think it's extremely hard work for nowhere near enough pay with a lot of risk. And part of me is like, well, why do people do it? But when I spend time, with farmers in many parts of the world, I understand that, money is just a small part of it. It's an important part, but it's not the part. There's so much else. Connections to family, kind of community, tradition. Sometimes it's love. It's love for coffee. People love. I understand from farmers. There's for some of them, it's such a deep love of cultivating coffee trees, and you can taste it in what they create. Yeah, you wouldn't get that otherwise. Just sitting here in Berlin. You only get it when you're there.
The one thing you didn't mention in that list was communing with the land, which is something that generations before us, did a lot more than we do. One thing that I haven't been able to do as much with this show, and am working to do more, is leave the confines of this booth. I talk to a lot of people over video chat, and it's a great gift that I'm able to communicate with you halfway around the world. But at the same time, really trying to get out and say, hey, how is this actually impacting people's lives? And who are these people that are working in coffee? It's such an expansive industry.
Huge. Yeah.
Who should be listening to your podcast? And I ask that because when you say it's about coffee, it almost narrows the audience, to people who are focused on coffee. But I don't think your shows are really they're really about so much more.
Absolutely. I say I use coffee as a lens to understand the world, to see the world. So it's really for anybody who enjoys a good story, who enjoys learning, who enjoys kind of narrative audio, and also is a coffee drinker, or not even a coffee drinker. I know people who listen to my show who don't drink coffee for whatever reason, but they enjoy it for other reasons. So yeah, it's really it's an opportunity, I think, to learn about the world, be transported to a different place. And that's it. If that's of interest to you. People who like my show tend to like, NPR a lot. They tend to listen to, Radio 4, BBC's type shows. They love documentaries. If you love documentaries and kind of learning about the world in that kind of way, well, this is what the show is about. Just using coffee as a way to understand the world.
You've been doing this, I think you said, since 2017. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How has your relationship with coffee changed since you first began doing the show?
I feel like it changes every year. I mean, it's a constant evolution. Okay, well, I've become seasoned, seasoned in the kind of sense of, I think when I first got into coffee, I was extremely naive about many things, about how the coffee industry worked, about what kind of principles it was operating under, many things. And spending more and more time exploring how coffee actually works, going really in depth. I've seen it. Yeah, it's made me change my understanding, but also see more things too that are kind of beautiful that I hadn't really appreciated in the first place. Like a sense of community, like how important coffee is to people in their everyday. The most recent change that's happened to me, I'm actually making an episode about it at the moment, is a kind of, how do I put it? When I was a younger, bushy-tailed coffee lover, I would soak up a lot of stuff, a lot of learnings from anything, right? From YouTube videos, from Instagram, from my local barista, you name it. Tips on how to brew coffee better, or why, roasting this way produces these sorts of flavors, whatever it is, right? A lot of things. Since I made my latest series, The Science of Coffee, I ended up speaking to a lot of scientists, and the scientists basically have been disproving so much of it. And I'm like, oh damn. Well, that's an uncomfortable truth, or lack of truth. I don't know. What do I do about it? How do I navigate a coffee industry, which I increasingly see as, well, just maybe some of these things that I'm being taught, I'm seeing and learning, maybe they're not actually true. What do I do about that? And how do I learn what's actually right and what matters? It got me quite existential, actually. The episode I'm creating is a very existential episode where it's about how I've basically tried to I use the analogy. I used to have this map of things that I learned from the specialty coffee world over the years. And I'm in this dark forest trying to get my way around, trying to find my way through. And I'm using this map. But every time I come to a landmark, I'd realize this thing that I thought I knew about specialty coffee, like how to brew better or whatever it is. I get there in the forest. I'm like, oh, this landmark's not here. I'm supposed to see a waterfall and I don't see anything. And so I talk about, I'm putting down the map and instead taking out a compass. And it's like the compass is really kind of three questions I'm asking myself, or three kind of principles I'm going to follow to help me navigate towards the truth and just be more accurate and actually invest my time in things that actually matter as opposed to things that don't matter in coffee. Anyway, it's kind of meta in that way. I'm trying to make it as entertaining as possible as an episode. It's really hard.
What matters is if you liked it. And I find what you just said to be extremely true. Every expert that I've ever talked to has a little bit of a variation on whatever they believe to be true compared to the person before and the person before. And just like a game of telephone, when you start on one end and everyone's telling you their version of the same thing, you end up somewhere way away from where you started. And I have found that sometimes I believe in the marrying of art and science in coffee. I think you need a little bit of both. But ultimately, if the truth is there or the science is there and I don't enjoy that cup of coffee, it's not for me.
I'm dying to express something there, which I think is basically an entire episode in itself.
Yeah,
literally is. But I'll give you like the 30-second synopsis. But to your point, right? There are a lot of things we see, a lot of practices we see in the specialty coffee industry that I see, and I'm like, how do I, like, for example, should you or should you not rinse your filter paper when you're making a pour over?
I've always learned that you should.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, so I spent 2 months exploring that question. I'm not even kidding. but in doing so, I really understood how to think critically and properly about this question. I spoke to Morten Munchau, who's a brilliant educator, and he straddles that kind of specialty coffee science divide. He works with academic scientists, but he's a trainer, roasting trainer, based in Copenhagen. He told me about Rosemary Pangborn's sensory evaluation framework, which is a very simple 3-step process. When any time someone says doing this, for example, the question, should you rinse your filter paper? Well, step 1, can you taste the difference? Right? Because if you can't, don't bother. It doesn't matter what else happens. But even that question, how can you taste the difference? Methodologically, how you actually brew the same coffee, super consistency, how you get lots and lots of data points, repeating, that's extremely hard. I go on that journey and it drives me bloody crazy, but I try to do it to answer the question. And then once you've answered that question, then you can go to, okay, great. There is a difference. Now, what exactly is the difference? Let's quantify that, Maybe it's a clearer flavor. Maybe it's lower bitterness, whatever it is. And then, most importantly, it's like, great. So this is how it changes the flavor. Now, who likes what? So this idea of and that just like throws this idea of like universal liking and this is what coffee flavors should be out the window. You like what you like. And when I spoke to a sensory researcher who does these sorts of sensory studies for like multinational companies, she even did a consumer analysis for coffee, like who likes what kind of coffee. It's vast. There's not one single, it's just huge. Everyone likes whatever. You can group them very, very broadly, but to say that there's like one way or one better flavor, it's just, it's ridiculous.
Well, and I think you addressed it in that show I referenced before about perception and taste, but simple things that you would never think of if you weren't paying attention to it the way that you are, or maybe I am, or a coffee lover is. But where you grew up, what foods you ate growing up is going to change what you think you like or what you don't like. Are you a spicy food person or a bland food person? I grew up in Wisconsin, which is a traditionally German food state. Bratwurst, cheese. We are dairy cows. That's our life. I didn't get into great foods like curry until later and realized, oh wow, there's this thing out there called spice. This is incredible.
Wow. Can I just say, I live in Berlin, Germany. Yeah. it might be like Wisconsin to some extent. Maybe not Berlin, but beyond Berlin's borders.
When I traveled to Germany the first time, I remember thinking I should have gone somewhere else because I feel like I'm just at home.
Right. It's very cosmopolitan.
But at the same time, one thing I really appreciated when I was traveling through Germany was that even though just about everyone that I met, especially in a restaurant or cafe, spoke English, they wouldn't speak English to me because, and I didn't know if that was on purpose, but I kind of felt like it was like, what, I'm in Germany, I should try to learn German. And it felt
you spoke German?
No. Not at all. So a lot of times I ordered things off the menu and was shocked when they came and I didn't know what they were going to be. But it was still fun. That being said, when you're out and about, when you're traveling around and you stop at a coffee shop, what do you order?
Oof. Depends on the coffee shop. Okay, if it's a really fancy coffee shop and they have a really special coffee I haven't had before, I'll go for that. If it's if it's a regular coffee shop, good solid specialty coffee, I'll go for something I can't make very often, which is cappuccino. I don't have an espresso machine at home. But my favorite question to the barista is always, what's good? What's your favorite thing right now? And just go from there.
What comes next for Filter Stories?
Well, so I'm wrapping up the second series now of The Science of Coffee. I have my partners now kind of already established for another series. I'm going to go deeper into other aspects of coffee science, which I'm really kind of curious to explore and kind of make simpler for my listeners. That will be the next year. Then it's more open. It's like every year, I don't know what it's like for you, but in this kind of media podcasting kind of space, it feels like every year it's hard to predict what you're going to be doing for more than a year. So I just kind of roll with it. And I'm thinking of doing a different kind of series, maybe a series I haven't done before. I'm exploring that idea at the moment, maybe around sustainability or around the business of coffee.
How do you manage to stay curious as you're several years in and focused on, I mean, there's a wide range of things to look at, but it still revolves around the same kind of core concept of coffee. How do you manage to keep that motivation going over time?
Good question.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, thank goodness, coffee is a extremely complicated thing. The coffee bean itself, it as a commodity, it's fast. There's a whole commodity side, there's the economic side, there's the sustainability side. We're talking about agronomy. There's the science of brewing. There's us as tasting instruments. There's the business side of the retail side of coffee. Coffee's like a thing which you can explore, which you can almost explore any aspect of the world through coffee. And so long as I'm a curious person, I will find a way to explore coffee. And maybe it's economics, maybe it's the science, maybe it's the history, or whatever it is. I will find a way to do it.
Before we go, I don't want to forget about this. You mentioned earlier that you'll be spending time in Brazil this year.
Mm-hmm.
What's that trip about? What's the motivation for it? What can we
Yeah.
expect to come out of that?
So I am producing my first documentary for the BBC World Service for their kind of podcast audio documentaries channel, which I'm really excited about because they have an enormous listenership of many millions of people globally. But more importantly, the story is one which touched me. It's about the plight of the jaguars in the Pantanal. The Pantanal being the world's largest tropical wetland that sits kind of below the Amazon. It's like a ginormous sponge that just like soaks up a lot of different rivers, and then which all feeds into the Paraguay River and kind of then out. And there have been ferocious wildfires these past few years, caused by many different factors. It's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. I'm very excited about it also from an audio perspective because, I want to kind of bring to life. I'm really excited to kind of bring to life all these different the sounds of of the land and all the critters in it, in this kind of audioscape, but also this story about really jaguars and an entire ecosystem under existential threat by basically human beings from different in different ways, be it dams, be it the Amazon deforestation, be it poaching, you name it. So
that's exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing an Instagram photo of you under the trees in the rainforest, drinking a cup of coffee with a jaguar in the background, just kind of looking on, wishing he was drinking that cup of coffee.
Let me tell you, if I'm going to be seeing a jaguar, there'll be a microphone pointed at his face.
I do love how you bring the environment into your shows. You use that word documentary a few times, and I think that really does set your show apart from other shows. I feel like I'm there with you when you're making 1 million cups of coffee at a convention or talking to somebody on a farm. So I do really appreciate that. And I really appreciate that you took an hour out of your life to talk to me and our audience. And I hope that someday we can have a cup of coffee together.
I love that. We should absolutely connect. And thank you for your great questions and taking an interest in what I do.
Okay, some key takeaways from the podcast. Drinking coffee is akin to traveling the world. At least, the learning about the coffee is. This morning, my coffee blend took me to Ethiopia, Brazil, and the island of Sumatra. Where did yours take you? Our conversation today, some of it off-air, began with James asking me questions. Frankly, it was harder for me to get a handle on this show because we are both so used to being the director of a conversation, not the focus. And of course, James is actually pretty easy to talk to. Eventually, we got into his story, which is when I hit the record button. He followed in the family tradition, becoming a banker. But it wasn't offering him that feeling of fulfillment that he believed was out there somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, attainable. So he quit and hit the road, literally in some cases, traveling by motorcycle across India despite having never ridden one before. Travel is also one of my favorite forms of procrastination. But eventually, James had to take another swing at something. the road of avoidance only goes so far. Coffee had always been a part of his life, and he decided to make it a career. Barista jobs were hard to come by, and so he spent time working for a corporate coffee business, before moving to Berlin to work for a well-known roaster. As one does when they're finding their way, he eventually felt the need to connect with the stories behind the coffee that he was not only selling, but describing and acting as if he had a relationship with. Inspired by the NPR and BBC style of narrative storytelling, James bought some equipment and hopped a plane to Guatemala to begin the audio effort that would eventually become Filter Stories. I took a lot from today's show, but nothing more than one sentence James uttered 2/3 of the way through our chat. Quote, "If nothing else, I had a good cup of coffee today." That is a piece of reflection that I'm going to try to take with me each day, because I have a pretty good cup of coffee almost every day. It's a nice pause in the morning. Finally, the second good lesson I took away from this conversation came near the end. James's recent interactions with scientists have been disproving, or at least providing a little unexpected context to, some commonly passed along coffee techniques or tips. Get ready for a double negative here. His message wasn't not to learn from experienced coffee experts, but to acknowledge that sometimes information passed down picks up a bit of snowball-like steam along the way that can throw it a bit off course. Trust, but verify if you can. You may not have access to a lab or the time to perform in-depth coffee experiments, and that's okay. Just know that not all things are set in stone. In coffee, as with seemingly all things, there is a bit of gray area where the anecdote has been just as influential as science. What matters, what really, really matters, is, did you like it? I said the word really twice, so you know that I meant it. You can listen to Filter Stories, currently exploring the science of coffee, on your favorite podcast platforms, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Or you can sign up for the Filter Stories newsletter on filterstories.org. While you're online, check out coffeepeoplepodcast.com and sign up for that newsletter too. That's our Coffee People conversation for today. Thank you for listening to the stories of Coffee People, for being inspired by their entrepreneurial efforts, and supporting this podcast by listening, sharing, and sometimes choosing the paid newsletter option on coffeepeoplepodcast.com. In addition to this podcast's presenting sponsor, Roastar Coffee Packaging, found at roastar.com, this podcast is supported by some great coffee industry partners. Our legacy partners include Zumbar Coffee and Tea, First Light Coffee Whiskey, Steady State Roasting, Moster Coffee, Coffee Cycle Roasting, Maria Coffee, and Cape Horn Coffee Importers. A special thank you to Alden at Crossings Coffee and the Hales brothers at Hosea Coffee Source, who've been supporting our Coffee Smarter efforts. And a shout out to our foundation builders, our full city partners, Ignite Coffee Company, Ascend Coffee Roasters, Ascento Coffee Roasters, Civets Roasting Machines, San Franciscan Roasters, and our newest supporter, Me and My Uncle Coffee, or Mamu Coffee, out of Central California. They are so new that their website is still under construction. But they're going to be doing some cool things in the direct-to-consumer space and collaborating with the Roast West Coast team on some creative coffee projects in the near future. So stay tuned for that. Coffee People will be back next week with the lead roaster of Bridge City Coffee in Greenville, South Carolina, Brandon Seabrook Nelson. You may have heard that Bridge City Coffee was recently named the 2024 Micro Roaster of the Year by Roast Magazine. Brandon and I talk about how that honor has changed things at Bridge City, his artwork, and how he represents himself and his community by doing the work. This show, the Coffee People Podcast, is part of the Roast West Coast Coffee Network. This episode has been written, produced, and recorded by me, Ryan Woldt. I hope this episode has found you happy, healthy, and with at least a thread of sanity left, enabling you to make it through the day. Always tip your baristas, and be sure to drink good coffee. I have zero podcast training.
Right.
Self-taught.
Okay.
So I was writing a craft beer and coffee newspaper column.
Cool.
I saw an opportunity with podcasts because I listened to them. to get the newspaper to pay me to learn how to make one. And
Brilliant.
so I pitched them this idea, and for a very small amount of money, they let me make a news podcast just covering our headlines of the week.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And that got me enough basic education that I thought I had spent a year learning about coffee, working as a barista just to learn, because I had passed on an opportunity to open a craft coffee and beer restaurant. And it was because I didn't know anything about coffee. And that really bothered me. And so when a friend opened a shop, I asked if he would teach me, and he said, come work one day a week and I'll teach you, and then you can help me with marketing and, business side of things.
Okay.
And I said, sure. I worked 6 days a week every day as a barista for a year, and we kept having these conversations. And even though that's not my life, I'll never be a full-time barista again. It's too difficult and I'm too old. I was hooked. That was it for me. And so I kept saying, we should record these conversations, and he wouldn't do it.
I see.
And then COVID hit, and I had an opporty, and here we are.
Okay. Cool. So you're a COVID. Interesting. Yeah. So an outgrowth of COVID. Interesting. And that was quite recently too. That was like, what, 5-6 years ago then?
Yeah. So 2020 would have been, late 2020 would have probably been the first show, early 2021.
But your barista experience would have been
2018,
teens.
Yeah, 2019.
Wow, cool. Good on you for just jumping in like that.
Thanks.
Backbreaking. Yeah.
I would work there. I'd work at Chris's shop from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and then I would run a restaurant from 10:30 to midnight every day for a year.
That's really intense.
If you are in the early stages of your coffee journey, we want to support you. Check out the Coffee Smarter Education podcasts. Coffee Smarter is designed to enable coffee drinkers to brew a better cup of coffee at home. And Coffee Smarter Pro covers industry-specific topics for baristas, roasters, shop owners, and aspiring coffee professionals. You'll find both shows on your favorite podcast platforms or on our website at coffeesmarterpodcast.com.